So I've been a pastor now for, I think it's like 34 years, and I have preached about Palm Sunday about 34 times. You know, I've gone over this passage many, many times. If you're a churchgoer, you've probably heard Palm Sunday sermons many times. Here at Bethel, we are teaching through the Gospel of John and just sort of how it is not a chronologically organized book, right? And so the way that we're structuring the schedule, Lord willing, on Easter Sunday, this coming Easter it's April in 2026. On that Sunday, Lord willing, I'll be preaching from John 20, which is the resurrection story. And so there's all this content between now and then, right? So this Palm Sunday happened on a Sunday, and then by that Friday, Jesus was crucified. So again, in the Gospel of John, there's a lot that's going on, much of which is happening that last week of Jesus' life. So I, again, having preached on this a lot and studied about the Palm Sunday event a lot, one of the things I've come to understand is that we really, to appreciate that event and really even to understand it, we need to understand a little bit about the history of it. And so on previous years, I've talked some about this, and so if you've been here for those, this will be some information you might already know. But for others of you, you might not be as familiar with this background, and either way, it's important and helpful to know, maybe as a refresher, maybe for the first time. A lot of people in the modern world, we have lost touch with the history of the ancient world. And so when we, in the 21st century, read these things that happened to Jesus, some of the things many of the things that he says and many of the things he does have ties to things that were going on then or in previous in the ancient world. And to really get an understanding of them, it's helpful to get that background. So before we talk about these verses in particular, we're going to talk about the story behind the story, okay? So the story that is behind the Palm Sunday story. So this goes back, Jesus' entry into Jerusalem on this day. The story about it goes back centuries. In fact, the Old Testament era ends about 400 BC. So at that point, the Israelites, they had been in exile, and they come back and they resettle in the Promised Land. And then there's a couple of prophetic books that deal with some of the things happening at the end of that history. And then it stops. And so there's this 400-year gap. And one of the most important things that happens during that 400-year gap is the rise of the Greek Empire. So they had been fighting against the Babylonians and the Assyrians. Well, then after the Old Testament era ends, a new power comes up, and that is the Greek Empire, particularly under Alexander the Great. You might remember this from history if you remember that as a kid. Alexander the Great conquers a huge section of the then known world, and after his death, his kingdom is divided into 4 areas. A couple of his sons, a couple of generals get the land. It's divided up into 4 kingdoms, and one of those is given to a general of his named Seleucus. And this then becomes, over the generations then, by the way, as you can imagine, as time goes on, these 4 groups fight each other for expansion of their territory. The Seleucid Empire grows significantly. And this is kind of hard to see, but these are the 4 groupings closer to when Christ was born. And the green, sort of teal, the big section is the Seleucid Empire. They took over a lot. And among the areas that they took over was Israel. Okay, so it was the Seleucid Empire that had control over Israel in the years leading up to Christ's birth. And their rule, well, and by the way, then not long before Christ's birth, then the Romans took over control of that from the Seleucid Empire, okay? Hope I'm not being confusing there. But the reason that the Seleucid Empire is important for our purposes today is because there was a tremendous amount of conflict between the Jews and the Seleucid Empire. Rulers came and went. The one thing that continued was violence and war and uprisings. And at one point, things got so bad between the Seleucids and the Jews that the Seleucids did something that was unimaginably insulting and horrible to the people of Israel. That is, they stormed the temple, they took over the temple in Jerusalem, and they sacrificed a pig on the altar. Now, for the Jews, pigs were a detestable animal. They were not kosher. And so to do that was a desecration of kind of the most holy thing that they had as a nation. And so that event triggered a massive revolt and started a guerrilla warfare led by a family of brothers named the Maccabees. And so this became known as the Maccabean Revolt or the Maccabean Wars, and they lasted for a few years. And by the way, during this period, a few of the brothers died, and by the end of it, only one of them was still alive. These Maccabean Wars are written about by the Roman historian or the Greek historian Josephus. And they're also written about in apocryphal books. The apocryphal books, there are a series of books that were written around the time of the Bible in the intertestamental period, but were not accepted by the church as canonical books to be in the Bible. But they're interesting, and in fact, two of these books are 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And they tell the story of some of these things that we're talking about here. So anyway, under the leadership of the Maccabees, who were, by the way, kind of like Joel was telling the story to the kids, the Maccabee story was similar. They were way outnumbered and outmatched, but they fought a guerrilla kind of war, and they won. They were victorious. So they pushed the Seleucids out of Israel for a time, out of Jerusalem. Part of that, at the end of one of these conflicts, they cleansed the temple, which we'll talk more about later. And then on a separate occasion, there was another skirmish after that. Then they had another battle, another victory. And at this point, only one guy is left. His name is Simon Maccabee. He comes back into town, and it's a massive victory. This is 160 BC. And here's what happened when he comes back into town. He rides into town, and the people all line the road where he's coming into town, and they took off their coats and laid it in front of him as he's coming into town, and they waved palm branches as he was coming back into town. Now, does that sound familiar at all, right? That was 160 BC, and it was imprinted in the minds of the Jewish people. In fact, the Jewish people still celebrate this event at Hanukkah. That's what Hanukkah is about, remembering the freedom that they won through the Maccabean Revolution. All right, so that's the story behind the story. A big deal in the minds of the people of Israel during Jesus' time, a victorious leader who would save them from their enemies, riding into Jerusalem, people lining the streets, putting their coats down in front of him, waving their palm branches. And that's what happened when Jesus entered Jerusalem. So we're going to talk about some components of this story that are contrasts comparison and contrast between Jesus' entrance and Simon Maccabee's entrance, and because it tells us some things about who Jesus was and what his mission was. First, I want to give you one other piece of background. I've mentioned this before, but again, it bears repeating. So this is the history before Jesus' time was fraught with political intrigue and violence and uprisings. Well, it was that way when Jesus was there too. I'm going to share a quote with you now from David Brooks about the time that Jesus lived. And this is why it's so important, because living in 21st century America, it's hard for us to understand what life was like for people back then. Well, let me just read to you a little bit about life for people in Jesus' time. This is what David Brooks says. To understand the work and message of Jesus, we must see him embedded in the Jewish world of 2,000 years ago. That world is nothing like the peacefulness of an American church pew. It was a world of strife, combat, and fractious intensity. The Holy Land then, as it is now, was a spiritual and literal battleground. The primary factor, the primary thing on people's minds, was foreign occupation. Jews and Jewish homeland had been oppressed and occupied for centuries. The Babylonians, the Syrians, which that was the Maccabees. That was the Seleucid Empire that the Maccabees fought, the Syrians. And then the Romans. Certain questions would have been electric in the air. Why are we oppressed? Who among our people is betraying us and collaborating with these occupying enemies? How do we survive as a people under the crushing burden of this foreign power? Everything was fraught, semi-hysterical, and tension-filled. Desperate gangs roamed the land. Minor league revolutionaries were perpetually rising up. In fact, N.T. Wright, who's one of the great New Testament scholars, lists 7 separate revolts that happened between the years 26 and 36, right around the time of Jesus' ministry. 7 separate revolts within the span of just a few years. That's the world that Jesus was ministering in. That's the environment where he gets on a donkey and comes into Jerusalem with all these associations that people had with military battles to fight off and save Israel from their foreign enemies. So now you get a sense of the story behind the story of Jesus coming into Jerusalem and why people were so confused about what he did and how he responded after that. So it's a story of contrasts for the people at that time, again, especially, and now you kind of understand that, reminiscent of Simon Maccabees coming into town as the leader and savior of the Jewish nation and cleanser of the temple from foreign desecration. So Jesus comes into town, and in your bulletin, there's a place to write down out some notes if you want. 4 contrasts for you. The first is the contrast of riding into town on a donkey versus riding into town on a horse. Verses 14 and 15 make clear that Jesus came in on a donkey. Now, we don't know this for sure, but we're 99.99% sure that Simon Maccabee rode into town on a horse. That's what leaders did. Military heroes did this. Generals, kings, they rode on horses. It was a symbol of power. But Jesus comes in riding on a donkey. So why a donkey? Well, first of all, why not just walk? Well, this is the only time we know of Jesus riding anything, and he's obviously doing this, choosing this means of transportation for its message that it's communicating. And so why a donkey and not a horse? At first you might think, well, it's because of humility, that he's not going to be a military leader. He's going to be a humble leader instead of a military leader like Simon Maccabees. And that's partially true. But what's going on here, it's about the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. It's connections to some of the teaching in the Old Testament, or some of the events of the Old Testament. And if you have your Bible there, you might have even noticed it on the screen. There are asterisks by some of those phrases in verses 14 and 15. When the people are calling out these words, they are bringing up passages from the Old Testament. There's our text says, John, in verses 14, John specifically makes the point that Jesus got on a donkey because, as it is written, he's referring to this Old Testament prophecy, which comes from Zechariah 9, about a king that comes into Jerusalem who is gentle and riding on a donkey. And so, again, by doing this, Jesus is calling to mind himself as a fulfillment of that prophecy. And now, the word gentle is used there, and we could make a big deal of that, and I think it's helpful to make a big deal of that, but be careful, because the prophecy in Zechariah 9 talks about other things too. This king that comes into Jerusalem on a donkey is gentle, but not only is he gentle, he's also powerful. The passage talks about him destroying the enemies and the weapons of war, and it talks about him by bringing peace by defeating the enemies. So this riding on a donkey thing was not necessarily, certainly not a weak image and not a passive image. He's coming as a king, but a different kind of king, a king that's related to Old Testament prophecy about the Messiah. The other thing that this is a connection to is another Old Testament event, which goes back to King David. When King David in Israel, when he was towards the end of his life, there was battles about who was going to take over as the king after him. And one of his sons leads a rebellion, tries to take over power. And again, it's a long story, but David actually selects a different son, Solomon, to become the king after him. And the way that he sort of validates Solomon as being the chosen king is that he has Solomon ride into Jerusalem on a donkey, on the royal donkey. And so once again, this is sort of like this public declaration of this person is the king coming into town. So Jesus is making that same deliberate connection there. And again, obviously, the people understood this connection, right? They got the symbolism because they're lining the roads. They're doing what they had done to Simon Maccabee, which is putting their coats down and waving the palm branches. They saw Jesus riding in, and they shout, Hosanna, which is save, and they call him the King of Israel. They thought they knew what was coming next. They thought this was the start of a new revolution. But as we'll see, Jesus has something different in mind. All right. Second contrast here is the contrast between the reception Jesus gets on the road versus the reception he gets in town. Now, the contrast isn't obvious at first in this Gospel of John, his account, but it's more obvious in the other Gospels. But even if you step back and think about it, it becomes pretty clear. Verse 13 describes the crowds. They're waving palm branches. They're quoting from Psalm 118. They're calling Jesus the King of Israel. Verse 17 adds even more detail that some of these are the people that had seen Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead or heard about it from others. The word spread. They all came out to see Jesus. So on the road, you've got this excited crowd of people that they believe something big is happening. That's the reception on the road. Look at verse 19. But the Pharisees said to one another, "See, this is getting us nowhere. Look, this whole world has gone after him. Where are the Pharisees?" I'll tell you where they are not. They are not on the road. They are not waving their palm branches. They're in Jerusalem. They're in the temple. They're watching this. They're hearing this. And they're getting upset. Now, you might wonder, how could they, if they're in town, how could they know what's going on? How could they see Jesus doing this and the crowds, and how could they hear these things? Well, if you've been to Jerusalem, it actually makes sense, because the old city is smaller than you might think. Now, the temple is huge. It's maybe bigger than you think, but the city and the geography there is smaller than you think. So this is looking out from the temple area. You can see the Mount of Olives from there. You look out over a valley, which is called the Kidron Valley, and then you see up a hill, and that is the Mount of Olives. So you could be on the temple or at the steps next to the temple and see what's happening with people coming down the Mount of Olives. And especially, back then there was not as much stuff there. And you could, trust me, you could hear, because when we were there, they have the Muslim calls to prayer that they put up on a speaker calls out, and they had a call to prayer up there on the thing, and you could definitely hear it clear as day on the temple steps. So the Pharisees are in there, and they're watching this. People are singing, waving branches, and shouting this stuff, and the Pharisees are panicking. The whole world has gone after him, and it turns out they're not wrong. If you have your Bible there, if you look at verses 20 through 22, it makes a reference to the fact that even some Greeks, some non-Jews, are coming to see Jesus. The crowd isn't just the locals. It's the word about him is spreading. So the contrast out on the road, people celebrating, they're hopeful, they're excited, they believe Jesus is their king in town. The Pharisees and the religious leaders are not liking what they're seeing. By the way, there's also Roman soldiers that are stationed or that are garrisoned or whatever in the temple, so they could see this too, and they're probably wondering what's going on and if there's going to be a fight that they have to worry about. So, all right, so that's the contrast between the road and the town. The third contrast is the cleansing of the temple from outsiders versus insiders. In John's gospel, the cleansing of the temple is not put here. In fact, you might remember we talked about it a little while ago, because John has it in chapter 2. But it actually happens right here. The other Gospels make this clear. And again, it makes sense. If Jesus comes down from the Mount of Olives across the Kidron Valley, the first thing he's going to encounter is the temple. And so that's where he goes right away. Again, this you could just imagine how excited people were getting, because Jesus is coming down like the Maccabean revolutionary, and they're celebrating him like the Maccabean revolutionary who cleansed the temple from their enemies. And so now Jesus is going to go into the temple, and there are those Roman soldiers in the temple. What is he going to do? Is he going to rescue us? Is this going to be the start of the revolution? If you look at, I'm just going to read a little bit from the book of Maccabees, from 1 Maccabees chapter 4, about what happened back then. At that time, Judas and his brothers, Judas was the oldest brother, and so Simon, who was live at the end, anyway, was one of those brothers. So Judas says, look, our enemies have been crushed. Let's go up and cleanse and rededicate the sanctuary. All the army gathered together and went up to Mount Zion. That's what they refer to as the place where the temple is. They found the sanctuary deserted, the altar treated with disrespect, and the gates burned. In the courts, bushes had sprung up like the open field on one of the mountains. They saw the priest's chambers were in ruins as well. So they tore their clothes and mourned with great sorrow. They sprinkled their heads with ashes and fell face down on the ground. When the trumpet sounded a signal, they cried out to heaven. Then Judas chose some soldiers to fight against those stationed in the elevated fortress, that's part of the temple there, until he completed cleansing the sanctuary. He selected priests who were blameless and devoted to the law. They cleansed the sanctuary and took the polluted stones to a ritually unclean place. That's what the Maccabees did, and that's what they were thinking Jesus was going to do. They kicked out the foreign invaders. They cleansed the temple from the way that it had been desecrated and defiled by these foreigners, which makes what Jesus does so jarring. He doesn't come into the temple and kick out the Gentiles. He doesn't go after the Romans. He kicks out fellow Jews. He drives out the money changers. He overturns the tables. He kicks out the people who are using the temple as a marketplace. He cleanses the temple from external, or not from external invaders, but from internal corruption. Can you give me back this? It is not working. There we go. Maybe the battery's going dead. Very, very different kind of revolution than what the people were expecting. He is saving them, but from a different threat than they were expecting. Okay, the fourth contrast. Jesus being welcomed and celebrated versus being doubted and resisted. Now the final contrast, and this is where we might get a little uncomfortable because it relates to us today. If you look at verses 37 and following, you'll see that there are different responses to Jesus, and I know we're going along in time, so I'll try to shorten this. Look at verse 37. It says, even after Jesus had performed so many signs, they still would not believe in him. We've seen that again and again. Jump down to verses 42 to 43. At the same time, many, even among the leaders, believed in him. So some of the people believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they would not openly acknowledge their faith for fear that they'd be put out of the synagogue. They loved praise from humans more than praise from God. So some believed but stayed silent because of fear. Some were resistant. The crowds were divided. Some people were confused. The religious leaders were working on a plot to kill him. And there's a temptation to read the Gospels from our vantage point and go, well, why didn't they understand this? Why didn't they see? They were just so clueless. If we had been there, we would have understood that Jesus was a different kind of Messiah. We would have gotten the fact that Jesus was saving the Jewish nation in a different way, right? We would have seen that. Well, David McCullough is one of the leading historians of our time. He recently passed away. He's won a couple of Pulitzer Prize for books he's written, won book awards, and he was asked about the challenge of writing about history, and he said, really the challenge is to get people to understand history. Because he says, we look back at history from our own perspective of knowing how it all turned out. And so we think, well, of course it would turn out that way. Everything seems obvious to us. The choices that people had to make seem very clear, pretty black and white. And we think, well, of course that was the right choice. Of course it was the choice to serve Jesus and acknowledge him as the Messiah, even though he was a very different kind of Messiah. How could those unspiritual morons miss it? But McCullough reminds us, he says it this way, we have to remember that our past was their present. They didn't have the benefit of hindsight. They were living in real time with all the uncertainty and confusion and complexity, kind of like we're living in today. and how we've got this confusion and complexity about what it means that Jesus is our Savior, what it means to serve Jesus. And so this question, who is this Jesus, is alive and well today. Now, I'll tell you what's weird. In our culture, is Jesus polarizing? Maybe the genuine Christian faith, there's a lot of battle about that, but everybody seems to love Jesus, right? Muslims love Jesus. Buddhists love Jesus. Spiritual but not religious people love Jesus. People who don't go to church, they'll say, I don't like the church, but I love Jesus. Everybody loves Jesus. Is it the real Jesus that they're responding to? That's the question. Because when the real Jesus was here, and he was really doing the things he was doing and saying the things he was saying, he was definitely polarizing. I mean, he was divisive. A lot of people heard his claims and just said, oh. And this is not just about the people out there, how people outside of our church are confused about all this stuff. We're still dealing with this today. Who is this Jesus? I wonder how much in the church we're like imposing our ideas about who Jesus is and what Jesus wants from us. I think for a lot of us, we want the comfortable Jesus. You know, our lives are pretty good. Of course, they could always be better. So we want Jesus to come in and make our good lives just a little better. We don't change our lives, but just make them a little bit better. The real Jesus, yeah, he does comfort, but he also confronts. He challenges. Throughout this message series, as I've done more of the research on the Gospel of John and Jesus' teaching in the Gospel of John, I am so struck by how lovingly confrontational he is. And he takes people and he calls them to not just a little bit better life. He calls them to a different kind of life, a different level of living. And so we're left with this question, who is this Jesus? Who is the Jesus that I'm responding to? Am I seeing him clearly or just an image in my mind that I'm imagining? The Greeks said, we would like to see Jesus, and so would we. The real Jesus, not just the one who fits our assumptions. So my prayer is, as we reflect on this chapter, we'll open our hearts up to the real Jesus, the one who came riding on a donkey, the one who came cleansing the temple from within, the one who divided the crowds and who still calls us to transformation.